All right, people, welcome. We are here for our fourth and final week of a series that I call, well, it helps to turn my page turner on. Okay, what I call Proud to be Presbyterian. This is about, we're learning about the distinctive elements of Presbyterian life and thought. Again, my name is Buzz Myers. I am a former professor of religious studies at Gettysburg College, a member of this presbytery as a minister at large, and an oftentimes speaker here at the Presbyterian Church. So welcome again. We are going to be dealing today with the issue of polity. And this particular thing, I'm going to call this particular session, I'm going to call, Why Does It Take So Long for Our Church to Change? I don't know that I'm going to answer that question as necessarily, but I'm going to give you an insight as to why it takes some time to change. But I thought, since I have shown you every single week, I've shown you the symbol or the seal of the Presbyterian Church. I just wanted to make sure that all of you are aware of the hidden symbolism in our seal. I think it's actually pretty neat, so I thought I would explain this to you. Here is the seal of the Presbyterian Church, and you see this everywhere. As I drove in the driveway today, there is a little U-Haul kind of thing out there that's got the Presbyterian seal on it and the like. Not all Presbyterians know what that particular seal symbolizes. So let me go ahead and explain to you that what we have here is the seal overall. But in that seal, you see the cross. See the cross. Right. You also see the pulpit. And on the pulpit, you see the Bible. Above the pulpit, you see the dove, the Spirit. You see the flames of Pentecost. You see the chalice, the cup, and the symbol of the early Christian church was the fish. It was not the cross. It doesn't become the cross until crucifixion is done away with in about the 4th century. It was Constantine, Emperor Constantine, who did away with crucifixion. But in those first few centuries, because crucifixion was practiced widely, that was a little bit too graphic for most people as a symbol. So the fish became the symbol. And the fish would be drawn because Christianity was an illegitimate religion. If you thought someone was a Christian, you would approach them and draw an arc in the sand. And a person facing you would draw an arc in the other direction and thereby make the symbol of the fish. In Greek, the word for fish is ichthus. Ichthus, it's 5 letters, and it stands for Jesus, Jesus, Christos, Christ, Theou, Huios, Son of God, Soter, Savior of the world. So the fish was the symbol of the early church, and you see the fish there, and you see the chalice below, or the cup. And you see the Trinity, this threefold triangle that you have here in the bottom right. All of those symbols are a part of the seal of the Presbyterian Church. Okay, well, let's go back and talk about, again, the Constitution and review quickly what we've done. We know that the Constitution of the Presbyterian Church consists of 2 books. We began with Book 1, which is the Book of Confessions, Part 1, and we looked at those 12 confessional creedal statements and some of the themes that we get in those in the first 2 sessions of our class. Last week, though, we dealt with the Book of Order, and the Book of Order has 3 documents plus an introduction, the foundations of Presbyterian polity, but it has the Directory for Worship, which is what we dealt with last week, and worship practices in the Presbyterian Church. Today we're going to look at the form of government, which is where the polity of the church or how the church is organized is stated most clearly. And we'll also touch briefly maybe on the rules of discipline, which is something that is not used as much in the Presbyterian Church as these other two documents are. Okay, we talked several weeks ago about my tree, my Protestantism tree, the four branches of Protestantism that come out of the Protestant Reformation, and you have that chart in front of you. If you didn't get a packet of information, please do that before you leave. But we saw that there are four branches. The first branch is the Lutheran branch, then we have the Reformed branch, followed by the Anabaptist branch, followed by the Anglican branch. And I talked about the history of those and sort of what their theological perspectives happen to be. I also talked briefly about the polity of these organizations. And I made the point that all of the churches on the right of my red line here, all of those churches are Episcopal in their form. Episcopal comes from the Greek word episkopos, which means bishop. All of these traditions, Roman Catholic, Episcopal, Methodist, Anglican, and Lutheran, all of them have bishops. And bishops make decisions that affect local churches. So there is this hierarchical structure in those traditions. On the opposite extreme, on the left-hand side of my red arrow, my red line, those are Anabaptist churches and others that have a congregational form of government. They have either no hierarchical structure or a very weak hierarchical structure. Basically, the local congregation makes decisions about the local church, and so it stays at the local level. Presbyterianism, which is what we are in the middle here, is a combination. There is a hierarchical structure, but that hierarchical structure is a grassroots up and then a top-down structure. And I'll talk about that in just a few minutes in more detail. Ours is a democratic form of government. We do not use the B word in Presbyterianism. Bishop. We don't talk about bishops in Presbyterianism. All of our leaders are elders. And all people in the Presbyterian Church who are in positions of leadership and authority are elected leaders. No one in the Presbyterian Church is appointed. Everyone who is an officer is elected. And I'll talk more about that in detail in just a few moments. But let's review the Presbyterian Church. Who are we? And let's do this simply by the numbers. Every congregation in our denomination is to report to the national church every year its statistics, membership, number of male and female in the membership, number of baptisms, deaths, your budget, how much people pledge, all of that kind of stuff is reported to the national church, and it's available for the most part online. So I can look at your church and find out all kinds of information based on information that's been reported to the national church. But the national church keeps statistics, and so let's look at some of those statistics. This is as of the end of last year. All of this is reported at the end of the year, so 2022 has not yet been reported. It won't be reported until the end of December of this year. So these are 2021 statistics. Our denomination consists of about 1.2 million members. 1.193770, if you want to be really exact. Those are active members. And I'll talk about active here in just a moment as well. 1.2 million, approximately 1.2 million members. Those 1.2 million members are organized into about 8,800 local churches. Those local churches belong to judicatories known as presbyteries. Presbyteries, and there are 166 presbyteries in the Presbyterian Church. And those presbyteries belong to synods, and there are 16 synods in the Presbyterian Church. And all of those synods and presbyteries are organized into one General Assembly. Okay? So we have General Assembly, synods, presbyteries, local churches. Those are the different levels of membership in the Presbyterian Church. There are also some new worshiping communities, some that don't fit into any of these like local churches. But an important part of this membership today, in this last year, there were 241 new worshiping communities that were started in the Presbyterian Church. So the number of those new chaplaincies and small groups and things like that that are organizing within the church is growing year by year. Let's begin with synods. I'm going to begin with synods. So here are the synods of the Presbyterian Church. Here are the 16 synods of the Presbyterian Church. You can see that some synods are massive. They cover a huge geographical area because there are not as many Presbyterians in those areas. Where Presbyterians are denser, and I use that in terms of numbers rather than mental capabilities, but where they are denser, they tend to be a little bit smaller. We're in one of the synods that is smaller geographically, but it is still a big synod. So here you see there are 16 presbyteries within our synod. We are called the Synod of the Trinity, and you'll see we are Presbytery. Carlisle Presbytery is one of those 16 presbyteries that are found in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Eastern Ohio. It'd be important to point out that our synod happens to be the oldest of the synods. It is the first one that was formed, and it first met, and it's always easy to remember, September 17, 1717, in Philadelphia. So ours is the oldest of the synods to meet. As I indicated, it's composed of 16 presbyteries in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. It has in it over 1,000 churches. Over 1,000 churches, 1033. And the membership there is about 126, almost 127,000 members. So there are a lot of Presbyterians in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Eastern Ohio. And its office is located in Mechanicsburg. It recently moved from Camp Hill. It is now in Mechanicsburg. Well, within that synod, one of the 16 presbyteries within that synod is Carlisle Presbytery, and that's the presbytery to which we belong. So, what are the statistics on the Presbytery of Carlisle? Presbytery of Carlisle has 8,900 members in 41 different churches. 40 of those churches are in south central Pennsylvania. We actually have one that is located in northern Maryland as well, just over the border. And ends up being closer to us than it is to Baltimore, which would be the presbytery that it would normally, you would think, would be a part of. But we have one in Maryland and 40 in south central Pennsylvania. It covers 8 counties: Adams, Cumberland, Dauphin, Franklin, Fulton, Juniata, Lebanon, and Perry counties, and this northern Maryland county as well. And one of our former presbyter executives used to like to say that the Presbytery of Carlisle covers 3 of the 4 tunnels on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. So if you're familiar with the Turnpike and you know the tunnels, 3 of the 4 are in our presbytery. And our presbytery stretches from just east of Breezewood through Lebanon. Lebanon in the east, and it goes to the west just east of Breezewood. So it is fairly wide in terms of area. But The median size of churches in our presbytery is 137 members. And more than half of the churches in our presbytery have fewer than 150 members. And that compares, I looked this up as well, church-wide, the median presbytery is a membership of 5,500 and an average of 53 churches. So we have more people in our presbytery, but we have fewer churches than is the average denominational-wide. Okay? Remember this. More than half of our churches have 150 members or less, and the average size, the median size of church and presbytery is 137. Okay, well, where does Derry fall in terms of membership in the presbytery? This is what took me most of the week, trying to run down all of these numbers. Okay, so let me do this. I'm not going to bore you with all of them, but I want to make a very important point about membership. So, we have only 6 churches in our presbytery. 6 churches that have a membership between 1,000 and 500, or 500 to 1,000, whichever way you want to look at it. Okay? We have 6 of them. Those 6 are, with their membership, Derry, Gettysburg, Falling Spring, Mechanicsburg, Silver Spring, and 2nd Carlisle. And look who tops the list. And notice that the next smallest church, or the next church in size to you, is 250 members smaller than the Derry church. And why I point this out is it's really important for members of Derry to recognize that what happens at Derry does not happen in all churches. You have an abundance of opportunities here. You have an abundance of leadership here. You have an abundance of facilities here that other churches don't have. And in fact, most churches have nowhere near what you have at Derry. And it's really easy for someone at Derry to fail to recognize the struggles that other churches have. So I simply want to point out, you people are at the top of the heap here, that there are a lot of people that are trailing behind. There are 40 churches in our presbytery that are well behind you. So you're standing at 885 at the end of last year. We have 6 churches that are in that 500 to 1,000 range. We have 5 churches that are in the 500 basically to 250 range. And those 5, Market Square in Harrisburg, Central in Chambersburg, the Camp Hill Presbyterian Church, the Paxton Church in Harrisburg, and Christ Camp Hill, those five have somewhere between 499 and 250 members. That means 11 churches out of 21 in our denomination have more than 250 members. 11 out of 41. And if I'm doing my math right, that means that 30 fall below the 250 mark. And that, in fact, is the case. We have churches that are in this 150 to 250 range. We have 7 of those. In the 150 to 100 range, we have 8. Those that are from 60 to 100, we have 8. And we have 7 churches that have fewer than 60 members. So that means we have a total of 30 churches that fall below the 249 member mark. When you look at this median-wise, or sort of church-wide, the median church size in Carlisle Presbytery is 137, as I said, but the average in the church-wide is about 148. But 60% of our churches have somewhere less than 100 members. 60% of the churches denomination-wide have 60 members, have 100 members or less. Boy, I really messed that up. Let me do that again. Denomination-wide, we have 60% of our churches that have 100 members or less. So we are a denomination of small churches. And you may not recognize that because you are a part of a large church, a very large church, the largest in our presbytery. Now, we've talked about different levels of leadership in the church. So we have sessions, we've got local churches, we've got presbyteries, we have synods, and we have the General Assembly. Presbyterians have a unique way of paying for all of those other judicatories. And there are expenses that go with office expenses, electricity, and office machines, and paper, and stuff like that, as well as some salaries for people in those different positions who are permanent members. But how do we pay for it as a denomination? Many denominations do this by a percentage of your budget. So the church may ask, in the Methodist church, let's say, the Methodist church might ask each church to give to its structure, its polity, its organizational structure, maybe 2% of its budget. So depending on what your budget is, that determines what you give to the denomination. That's not how we do it. That's not how we do it. We do it according to what's called a per capita assessment. A per capita assessment. And we give money to those three levels, to presbytery, to synod, and to General Assembly. And each of those bodies determines how much you give to that level of governance. So I'm going to just show you sort of the statistics here over some years. The Presbytery of Carlisle. The Presbytery of Carlisle each year says what each member of the church needs to pay to the presbytery. Then that's added to what the synod decides every person needs to pay. And that's added to what the General Assembly says every person needs to pay. And that gives us a total of how much the church is billed for each active member of the church. This coming year, it will be $31 per member. Last year, it was $29 per member. This is the cost of having an organizational structure. This, though, also tells us why our statistics, when we talk about membership, those statistics are accurate. Those are really active members because no church wants to be paying for dead wood. Right? In the Methodist Church and other traditions like that, because it's not based on membership, they don't clean their rolls. So there are all kinds of people that maybe belong to other churches who haven't been in that church for years and years and years. That's not true in the Presbyterian Church. When we say we have 885 members of this church, that means those are active members. And you can tell if you look at statistics over time that every church, in trying to cut back on its own expenses, will go through the rolls and move people from active to inactive membership. That's part of what the rules of discipline talk about, how to go about that process. But move people off the active roll, and therefore you're not paying $31 per person. You're paying $31 per person for people that are truly active in the church. And one of the ways that I would say to raise money in any church, it's really easy to do, is to really educate people and get them to pay the $31 in addition to their pledge. If you don't pay that, then this comes out of your pledge. So pay this in addition, and all of a sudden in a place like Derry, you're talking about $25,000 that you are saving by having people pay the $31 in addition to a pledge. Okay, I want to just talk about the per capita and sort of why this is important for you to understand. This is the way of us sharing in the organization of the church. So it's a way that we acknowledge that we are dependent on these other judicatories and that we are involved in their lives and they are dependent on us for funding. Now, it is important to know that at the church level, churches get a bill from the presbytery about the per capita apportionment and how much they should pay for the active members they have. Payment of that is voluntary on the part of the church. The church can just thumb its nose and say, we're not going to pay that. That, however, doesn't mean that the presbytery is not on the hook for that money. So that money gets paid. It's only a question of who's going to pay it. And so if churches decide not to pay it, the presbytery has to pay it out of their budget for your particular church. So you can see in larger churches, this can be a lot of money that the presbytery has to cough up, basically to pay itself. I mean, it's really it's important to point out the presbytery pays the bill, whether the local church pays it or not. You have no right as a church to withhold it. You have no right to withhold it as a form of protest, although churches do that. And if they do it, the presbytery is supposed to be involved in trying to figure out what the cause is of their disagreement, why they have decided to withhold it. But if they choose to withhold it, the presbytery cannot force them to pay it. But the denomination forces the presbytery to pay that bill. Pay your per capita people. All churches need to pay the per capita. It's a part of our obligation as a church. $31 this coming year. And if you look at this over time, it's amazing how reserved there have been in increases. The presbytery hasn't raised its price. It did this year, and it's going to raise it again this coming year, but they have really, really held the line over the years, if you look at this over time. And Synod has been the same for years and years and years. They've increased a couple of pennies here and there. Okay, we're done with the per capita and the importance of per capita. Let's talk about members. Let's talk about session. Let's talk about ministers. Let's talk about other people in the church. So let's begin with members of the church, the ministry of members of the church. And I'm going to quote here, even though it's all in very small print, but I'm going to read it because you need to know what it means to be a member of a church in the Presbyterian Church. Here it is. Look at all this stuff. So a faithful member, and this is in our form of government, paragraph chapter 1.0304, a faithful member bears witness to God's love and grace and promises to be involved responsibly in the ministry of Christ's church. Such involvement includes, and here are the things you signed on to do, people, when you became a member. Proclaiming the good news in word and deed, taking part in the common life and worship of the congregation, lifting up one another in prayer, mutual concern, and active support, studying Scripture and the issues of Christian faith and life. That's why you're here. Supporting the ministry of the church through the giving of money, time, and talents, demonstrating a new quality of life within and through the church, responding to God's activity in the world through service to others, living responsibly in the personal, family, vocational, political, cultural, and social relationships of life, working in the world for peace, justice, freedom, and human fulfillment, caring for God's creation, participating in the governing responsibilities of the church, and reviewing and evaluating regularly the integrity of one's membership and considering ways in which one's participation in the worship and service of the church may be increased and made more meaningful. Now, I point this out because I think this is a wonderful, wonderful list of things that a minister, that a member of the church is supposed to do. But I also point out because a friend of mine, I have a personal connection with this list, a good friend of mine decided that this list was incomplete. He was a minister of a church in Philadelphia at the time, and he wanted to add in caring for God's creation. He is very much involved in the environmental movement and thought this needed to be a part of the responsibility of members. And so, for Presbyterian polity to get this in the Book of Order, Bruce ended up writing up a proposal that he then presented to Session. Session approved that. Session then took it to Presbytery to get Presbytery's approval of that overture. That overture then went to General Assembly. General Assembly went to committee with it. Committee brought it back, voting in favor of it, and had the General Assembly approve it. And then it came back down to all of the presbyteries to decide in favor of it. So a majority of presbyteries, after General Assembly had approved it, a majority of presbyteries had to approve it as well before it became a part of the Book of Order. That shows you the nature of our church, what's called the connectional nature of our church. We're related to these upper bodies, but it's a grassroots up structure, and then from the top, it's a top-down structure. So just because General Assembly declares something to be the case, until it's approved by presbyteries, that doesn't become law in the Presbyterian Church. But you can see, here is one person's interest and one person who used the system to get this put into the Book of Order. It's near and dear to my heart. I ended up writing sort of a support of this a number of years ago and all of that. But it does show you that people who have particular causes or particular issues can get changes made to the Book of Order and the way Presbyterians work.
Bill. How long did that take?
Well, it would take, it depends how often.
On that one?
On this one, it took 2 years.
Oh, only 2.
But part of the problem was the GA only meets every 2 years. So by the time it got up there and then got approved, it was probably 2.5 by the time it got back down to presbyteries. Yes?
But as you did the structure of the Presbyterian Church, you had synod, but when you did this description of how that got added, you skipped synod.
Right, right. Synod can send overtures to General Assembly, but it's the presbytery that tends to send those more directly to General Assembly. It doesn't have to go through synod. Synod doesn't meet. What's happened, and this is sort of an interesting development, to save money, and because there were some contentious General Assemblies a number of years ago, it was decided that General Assembly would be a biennial meeting. So it meets only once every 2 years. And when General Assembly only meets once every 2 years, there's a lot of business that needs to get done before that time, so presbyteries end up benefiting with more power because General Assembly's not around to make decisions. Presbyteries are making decisions. So presbyteries have been empowered more by the infrequent meeting of General Assembly. But changes to the Book of Order still have to go through the General Assembly.
What's the role of synod in today's world?
Synod is actually the weakest child in that structure. And in some cases, it's completely ineffective. We actually live in an area where the Synod of the Trinity is a stronger synod. It's primarily educational. It supports a number of causes that are related to our geographical area. But it used to have synod school and the like. They don't do much of that anymore, but they used to have a program, and I taught for years at synod school. It was a week-long sort of Christian education thing at Wilson College, and lay people would come and ministers would come to it and learn various things. So it had an educational role for many, many years. It's not, we're paying $2.40 for it, so it's not as strong a partner in that process as it might be. But those are the ones, if you did away with any of those levels, that would be the first to go. Presbyteries and General Assembly are critically important. Synod less so. Okay. Caring for God's creation. Here is the connectional nature of the church, which I talked about before. And I'll just go through this again quickly. But members of the congregation, one of the things you do is participate in the governance of the church, and one of the things you do is elect officers. You elect officers, and our officers are elders, deacons, and trustees. You also elect a teaching elder, which is the pastor. The pastor is not appointed. The congregation elects a teaching pastor or an elder. I'm sorry, teaching elder or a pastor. The pastor is the one who serves as the moderator of session. And the session is composed of the elders that the congregation has nominated and has elected. The pastor has a vote if installed. If not installed, you do not have a vote. I am working with a church, and have for a number of years now, that is without a minister. They need a moderator of session, and they need a pastor to do it. So I've been moderating their session. But because I'm not their installed minister, I can't vote in their deliberations. I can moderate it, but I can't vote. If you have an installed person, that person would be able to vote in session. One vote. Session is going to elect a representative to accompany the pastor to presbytery. So one of the session members is going to go to presbytery with the minister. That could be online, and has been for a number of months now. And then presbyteries are going to elect representatives to attend both synod and general assembly. Those are different candidates. You don't send them to both. You send them either to synod or to general assembly. But the presbytery elects from its membership people who go to synod and general assembly. What I want to point out about this structure, again, all these people are ones who are elected to those offices. You become a representative through election. But I also want to point out an important characteristic of this particular structure, and that's equal representation in all of these bodies, in presbytery, in synod, and in general assembly. You strive to have an equal number of ruling elders, which is what elders we think of as session, and teaching elders or pastors. It's really important that in the Presbyterian Church, people don't view these judicatories, presbytery and synod and general assembly, as a clergy club. It's not. Everything we do in those upper adjudicatories is supposed to be balanced. It's supposed to be a balance between ordained ministers and ordained elders. If your church has 2 ministers on staff, you're supposed to send 2 elders to presbytery to offset their votes. If you have 3, you're supposed to send 3 elders, depending on the number of ministers. And then other churches that are larger sometimes send more, because I, for instance, when I go to presbytery, there's not an elder that I take with me. So in order to bring parity here, to make sure that it's not just the minister's voice, we've got to make sure that we have enough elders involved in the organization and leadership of the church at every level. Okay, and that's basically what's being said there. Okay, with this in mind, that we want equal representation, well, let's go back to the session. The session is elected. Every member of the session has been elected primarily to a 3-year term. That can be renewed for another 3-year term. To have any more requires presbytery approval. To have a 3rd term, or even part of a 3rd term, requires more. We've got term limits in the Presbyterian Church. So we've got a 3-year term that can be renewed for another 3 years. Those members, those elders who are elected as ruling elders, make up what's called the session. The pastor is the moderator of session, and the session is the governing body of the church. It is the governing body of the local church. And look at what it is responsible for taking care of. Membership, worship, education, finances, administrative support, property, and the calling of meetings of the congregation. Basically, the session does everything. So when you're on session and you're wondering why your meetings are so long, all you need to do is look at the responsibilities that the session is entrusted with. Now, session has the right. They have the right to give some of these responsibilities to others. And so there are churches that will give some pastoral responsibilities to what's called the Board of Deacons. Or they may give some financial responsibilities to an organization called the Board of Trustees. You do not need to have deacons. You do not need to have trustees in a church. But many larger churches do have those 2 boards. But it is the session that empowers both the Board of Deacons and the Board of Trustees to cover the work that they cover. They can delegate responsibility. In the church I'm working in now, we don't have enough leadership to fill 3 boards. So we're working on becoming a unicameral, a one-house body, where the session would have both deacons' responsibilities and trustees' responsibilities. You have a lot of leadership in this church, and the result is you don't have a unicameral board here. Well, this is what the session is responsible for, what elders are responsible for. For instance, elders are the ones that determine what's required to be a member of the church. What are the standards for membership, and who teaches the people that want to be new members and the like. All of that is decided by the session, as our educational programming and the like. That's all a part it's under the purview of session. Let's look at the minister and requirements for ordination. We talked about this and how I drove someone out of the Presbyterian Church just by showing them what the requirements for ordination happen to be, but they are extensive. And so ministers in the Presbyterian Church just didn't wake up one morning and say, gee, I think I'll be a minister, and then they got ordained the next day. It takes a long time to get to the position of being ordained. You have to be the member of a Presbyterian church. That seems to be pretty important. When you want to become ordained, you've got to be approved by the session of that local church. And then you have to be approved by the presbytery and supervised by the Committee on Preparation for Ministry for a time that's designated by that committee. In the meantime, you need to earn a bachelor's degree, which is the 4-year degree, at least 4 years of full-time study. You need a bachelor's degree, and then you also have to go to seminary. And a seminary degree can be either 3 or 4 years, depending on whether you're required to do an internship at your particular program. So Presbyterian seminaries don't require an internship. Some other seminaries do. And so theirs is a 4-year, whereas ours tends to be a 3-year program. And those areas of study that you must tackle are both Greek and Hebrew. Everyone just loves taking Greek and Hebrew, but you have to take Greek and Hebrew language and interpretation. So you have to learn to use those languages in interpreting texts from the Hebrew Bible and the Greek New Testament. One of everyone's favorite tasks in the MDiv program. Then, after you've done all that, you have to pass 5 written ordination exams called the Ords that are graded by people like Bill. Bill is going to be grading these this week. People who have written some of those exams are going to be graded by pastors and by elders. And we are going to, hi there, we're going to do.
It's Debbie. I'm Debbie.
I know.
Oh, no, I didn't. I just wanted to say.
Hi Debbie, our former
Sorry.
Director of Christian Education has just appeared in the back there. Hello. So you have to pass 5 written ordination exams, and then you have to be approved by the Committee on Preparation for Ministry. Then you have to be approved by your own presbytery, and then you've got to receive a call from a church and be approved by the presbytery of the church of the presbytery that the church belongs to where you want your job. As I say, you don't wake up one morning and say, I think I'll be a minister tomorrow. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of years to get to the point of being ordained. Well, what does a minister do? What are the responsibilities of the minister? Again, I want to make the point, I said this earlier, but I want to really drive home the point that the Presbyterian Church is not a minister-centered denomination. The church does not rise and fall on the minister. You can survive without a minister. What you can't survive without is a session. The elders are the heart and soul of the church. So the minister has distinct responsibilities, but it's not the minister's bailiwick. It's not his or hers to do with what he or she wants to do. So there are responsibilities that the minister has. They are supposed to participate in the work of the presbytery once you are ordained. Remember, to be ordained, you have to be a member of a church. Once you're ordained, you're no longer a member of a church, you're a member of the presbytery. So presbytery is the one that you answer to. Presbytery can call you on the carpet for problems or things that you're doing that are wrong, or if you need correction or guidance or whatever. Presbytery is oversight of ministers. Ministers belong to presbyteries, not to local churches. What ministers do is study, teach, and preach the word. They administer baptism and the Lord's Supper, and they pray with the congregation. Pray with and for the congregation. They have complete freedom to choose the scripture passages to be read in worship. And they have complete freedom to prepare the sermon as they see fit. No one can come up and say, I don't want you to preach on that passage. I don't want you to read that passage. That is purely the minister's choice, as is the music. If you've got a complaint about the music, the minister should hear about it. The minister is the one who chooses the music. Now, if you're like me, who is tone deaf, what you want to do is have a really good minister of music that you can sort of delegate that responsibility to. But that doesn't come with the job. The minister is the one that has exclusive right to choose the music. She or he may choose to have the music director or the minister of music choose that for them. But it is the responsibility of the minister. You also have to conduct special services, funerals, and weddings where those are needed. You moderate meetings of the congregation. you moderate meetings of the session, and you're able to vote in meetings of the session. If you're installed, you're not able to vote at a meeting of the congregation. Meetings of the congregation will often be about the salary of the minister, and they don't think that's quite fair for you to be voting on whether to increase your salary or not. So you don't vote in a congregational meeting. You do serve on a nominating committee, but you're ex officio, you don't vote there. And the relationship that is established with the church is one that is endorsed by the presbytery and the session. And so if the minister wants to leave, the minister initiates the dissolution of that relationship. The minister has to inform the session and the presbytery, and they have to agree to dissolve the relationship. You just don't walk out. You have responsibilities to the session and to the presbytery if you want to dissolve the relationship. Now, the presbytery can dissolve the relationship, and the church itself can dissolve that relationship. They can initiate that as well. But most of the time, it would be the minister that is going to initiate the dissolution of the relationship. And I'll simply point out again what is another important factor in our denominational polity is this notion of checks and balances. As I say, Presbyterians do not invest all of this power in ministers. Ministers have a single vote. They don't get their will in all kinds of things. The session can overrule the minister. The minister only votes once. So they have distinct responsibilities. Ministers have distinct responsibilities, but they are not the only leaders of the church. In every judicatory, as I indicated, there's supposed to be an equal number of ministers and elders. And ministers moderate session and have a vote, but they only have one vote. They don't have the power to veto or to demand that the session do what they want. No, the session makes that decision. And the minister votes. Ministers are not a law unto themselves. Ministers are called by the congregation of the local church. But there is direction from the presbytery in the calling of a minister. You have to be in communication with the pastor nominating committee needs to be in conversation with the Commission on Ministry of the Presbytery. And then the PNC nominates a candidate to the congregation. So after the PNC has done all of its work, it nominates a candidate, and then the candidate preaches, and then the church votes. But it's the congregation that elects. The PNC only nominates. You haven't done that in a few years here, but if you remember how Stephen was called, this is the procedure that went. He was nominated, brought here, and then he was voted on by the congregation. Ministers have to be approved by the presbytery and become members of the presbytery when they are approved. But there is even checks and balances in what the minister is able to do, and the check on the minister is the session. So notice, this is some interesting stuff. The minister baptizes people, that's true, but session has to authorize all baptisms. The minister just doesn't decide, oh, I think today I'll baptize a few people. I'll go to people's homes and I'll just baptize people. You can't do that. You can't baptize in the Presbyterian Church without prior authorization from the session. Minister celebrates the Lord's Supper, that's true, but you have to get prior approval from the session to do so. The minister preaches the sermon, that's certainly the case, and you can't step on the minister's toes there, but the session decides when worship will happen. The minister can't just sort of announce, well, I'm a night kind of person, so we're going to have worship at 9 p.m. That's when I'm awake. That's when I want to have worship. You can't do that. The session decides when worship happens. And a minister can officiate at weddings. You're allowed to do that. But if you want to have a wedding in your church, the session is the one that has control of the property. So you have to have permission of the session to do a wedding in a church. All of this is a way of checking and balancing the power between minister and session, so that it's not simply a clergy club where ministers just get their way. The problem is, as we've seen, there is a lot of work that needs to go into becoming an ordained minister, and we are finding that there are fewer and fewer people graduating from college who are going to seminary to train, and so the Presbytery and the Presbyterian Church has come up with something called the commissioned it's ruling elder. The commissioned ruling elder. And this is a program where elders of churches can undergo a period of study and field education. And at the end of that time, after they've met the requirements laid down by the particular presbytery, they can serve in a church as a pastor. They're called a CRE, and they can administer sacraments, they can administer baptism and do the Lord's Supper and the like in that particular church. They're not ordained as ministers are to the church university. They're ordained for that particular church for a particular period of time. But that's a way of maybe trying to get some of the smaller churches that are having a hard time finding an installed minister to get them some ministerial support. And that's one of the ways that the church has moved to try and streamline the educational requirements and get some people that are educated laypersons into clergy positions. All of that is a lot, I know. And I guess one of the basic points I want to make is that we are a relatively small denomination. When you compare some of the other Protestant denominations or some of the evangelical denominations and the like, we are relatively small compared to them. But our impact today and down through history has far, far outweighed our number. We have punched well above our weight in the history of the United States. So, for instance, I'm going to do this quickly. I know we don't have a whole lot of time, but I just want to point out important Presbyterians that you need to be aware of. Okay, founders of the nation. There were 12 Presbyterians in the Continental Congress. All of them helped to shape the Declaration of Independence. All of them were involved with the writing of the Constitution of the United States. And that's one of the reasons why the way the federal government is organized on Presbyterian polity, this notion of representative government, where you elect representatives and those representatives represent you in these higher judicatories, and those have to be approved. For instance, amendments of the Constitution have to be approved by a majority of states after it goes to the federal government. Well, there are three fairly well-known signers of the Declaration of Independence who were Presbyterian. The most famous is John Witherspoon. You may not know John Witherspoon, but you sure know John Witherspoon's great-great-great-great-granddaughter, Reese. She's a descendant of one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And this was a big gun. This guy helped to found Princeton University and was one of the first presidents of Princeton University, which was founded to train Presbyterian ministers. Another important one was Benjamin Rush. He was a physician, and he's the founder of Dickinson College, which is the first liberal arts college. It's the first of something. I thought Harvard was first, but this is the first liberal arts college or whatever in the United States. Very early. It's a really early college. And then James Wilson, who was one of the first justices of the Supreme Court, was an attorney. All three were very, very prominent Presbyterians of the 18th century. We've had a number of presidents that have been Presbyterian. Andrew Jackson was the first. Abraham Lincoln was not a Presbyterian, but when he attended church, He attended a Presbyterian church in both Illinois and in Washington, D.C., and after delivering the Gettysburg Address, he walked down the street and went to worship at the Gettysburg Presbyterian Church. There was a pew where he sat that no one else is allowed to sit in on penalty of death, I think. But it's roped off, you can see, but there's a little flag in the lake. It's this old pew where Lincoln is supposed to have sat in the Presbyterian Church in Gettysburg after giving the Gettysburg Address. Grover Cleveland was a Presbyterian. He's the one that served 2 terms that were split by another one, Benjamin Harrison, and Benjamin Harrison was a Presbyterian. Woodrow Wilson was a Presbyterian and ended up being the president of Princeton University himself in the early 20th century. Then Dwight Eisenhower, a member of the Gettysburg Church, the minister of the Gettysburg Church, who was a good friend of mine, did both Mamie and Dwight's funeral service, and then died just before preaching at a Presbytery meeting. It was really sad. He was supposed to stand up and preach, and he died. They looked around, and he had slumped over in his chair, and he died just before he was supposed to preach. And if we can choose when you can be taken, I want to be taken after my sermon. I don't want to spend all this time. I don't want to spend all this time getting to the point, of preaching and then be taken with the sermon unpreached in my lap. So we probably don't get to choose. Other ones in politics. Just show you a couple of people here: Dulles, Rusk, McNamara, Warren Burger, perennial favorite Ross Perot, Condoleezza Rice, Bill Frist, John D. Rockefeller IV, Lamar Alexander, all Presbyterians, across the aisle, both Republicans and Democrats. We have leaders of industry, business, philanthropy: Carnegie, Wanamaker, Mellon, Luce, and Sam Walton. I don't know if you knew that Sam Walton was a Presbyterian. Sir John Templeton, who signed both of my diplomas from Princeton Seminary, is another one who is a